The West Sea in March carries the cold that continental Asia has been accumulating all winter and releases at the coast in waves of northwest wind that do not diminish at the shoreline. At 3:11 a.m., the surface temperature is -3 degrees Celsius, and the wind from the northwest at 24 knots has pushed the effective temperature on deck to approximately -16. The sea is not frozen. The wind and the wave action keep the surface liquid, but the spray that contacts the ship's topside surfaces freezes within 15 seconds, and the forward deck has acquired a coating of ice that the crew has been removing with rubber mallets every 2 hours to prevent stability degradation. USS Curtis Wilbur makes 14 knots on a southwesterly heading, 41 nautical miles south of the northern limit line, operating in support of a combined USROK surface deterrence package that has been in the West Sea for 4 days. She has been at modified readiness since 2:47 a.m., when the intelligence assessment updated. The 152mm coastal artillery battery on the North Korean coast near Ongjin had shifted to what the community characterized as active fire preparation posture. The 152mm howitzer is a heavy artillery piece. It fires a 43-kilogram projectile at approximately 810 meters per second, with a time of flight to the NLL adjacent operating area of approximately 22 to 28 seconds, depending on range and charge selection. The battery fired at 3:11 and 7 seconds a.m. The general quarters alarm sounds at 3:11:09 a.m., 2 seconds after the battery's muzzle flash was detected by the ship's passive optical surveillance system. At 22 seconds time of flight, 2 seconds of detection time means 20 seconds of maneuvering time before the first round arrives. The helmsman puts the wheel over. The ship is turning. The first round is a miss. It impacts the water 230 meters off the port beam, having been aimed at the ship's position at the time of firing rather than its turning position. The second round is a miss. The third round misses. The fourth round misses. The ship's starboard turn is opening the range and changing the bearing geometry, which requires the battery to resolve its fire control solution. The fifth round arrives while the battery is adjusting. It lands 180 meters off the starboard bow. The sixth round is not a miss. It hits the Wilbur's port hull at frame 61, approximately 0.4 meters below the waterline, at 3:11:47 a.m. The 152mm projectile is not a shaped charge designed for armor penetration. It is a high explosive round, a steel casing filled with approximately 7 kilograms of TNT equivalent that detonates on contact with the hull. The detonation tears a hole in the hull plating at frame 61 of irregular dimensions, largest at approximately 35 centimeters by 62 centimeters, widest at the bottom, where the blast energy had the most room to expand outward before contacting the hull frame at frame 62. The frame at 62 has absorbed the blast energy and has deformed but not fractured. The structural frame is bent inward approximately 11 centimeters, but remains continuous, which is the only reason the breach is 35 by 62 rather than larger. The adjacent frame at frame 60 shows no visible deformation. The hull plating at frame 61 is gone in the breach area. The edges of the breach are ragged, inward bent, and sharp. The hull space at frame 61, port side, is the forward fuel storage compartment, one of the 4 JP5 aviation turbine fuel tanks in the ship's fuel management system. The tank is a structural integral fuel cell, meaning the ship's inner hull forms one face of the tank. The 152mm round detonated on the outer hull face at frame 61. The outer hull is gone in the breach area. The inner hull, the inboard face of the forward fuel storage compartment, has received the blast overpressure and sustained a deformation of approximately 8 millimeters inward over a 40-centimeter diameter area centered on the breach, but has not fractured. The JP5 tank's inner hull is intact. For now, The breach at frame 61 is 0.4 meters below the waterline at the ship's current speed and trim. Flooding begins at 3:11:48 a.m., 1 second after the round detonated, at an ingress rate of approximately 420 gallons per minute through the irregular opening. The flooding is entering the void space between the outer hull and the inner hull of the forward fuel tank. A structural void space approximately 18 centimeters wide, not a habitable compartment. The void space connects to the adjacent damage control access space at frame 59, which is a small compartment approximately 1.5 meters by 2 meters, used for inspection access to the fuel tank fittings. At 3:11:50 a.m., 2 seconds after the flooding begins, the flooding alarm for the frame 59 to 61 zone activates in DC Central. The chief engineer is in DC Central. He has been in DC Central since the general quarters alarm. He reads the flooding alarm and the supplemental report from the frame 59 damage access space that the watch petty officer is already opening. Breach at frame 61. Flooding at the waterline level. Rate estimated at more than 300 gallons per minute. The battery fires again at 3:11:52 a.m. A second salvo of 6 rounds. 4 of the 6 rounds are fired at the Wilbur's current position. The ship is still maneuvering. 2 rounds impact in the water within 100 meters of the ship. 2 rounds miss by wider margins. The battery has not stopped firing. At 3:11:59 a.m., the commanding officer issues the order. All ahead flank, course 270, directly west. The westerly course increases the range to the battery at the maximum rate possible for a ship doing 21 knots. And with flank speed, the range from the battery is opening at approximately 1,300 meters per minute. At this rate, the Wilbur will be outside the 152 millimeters effective range in approximately 12 minutes. This is the immediate tactical solution to the battery problem. It is not a solution to the flood problem. At 21 knots on a westerly course, the ship is moving at speed through 3-meter west sea swells. The breach at frame 61 is 0.4 meters below the waterline at rest. At 21 knots, the dynamic water pressure against the hull at frame 61 increases the effective submersion of the breach to approximately 1.1 meters due to the bow wave and hydrodynamic pressure at the hull's forward section. This increases the flooding rate to approximately 680 gallons per minute. The P250 dewatering pump, 250 gallons per minute rated capacity, is insufficient to arrest the flooding at flank speed. Even 2 P250 pumps running simultaneously cannot keep up with 680 gallons per minute. The flooding in the frame 59 to 61 void space and damage access space is rising at approximately 430 gallons per minute net. 680 gallons per minute in, 250 gallons per minute out from 1 P250. The damage access space at frame 59 has a volume of approximately 3 cubic meters, 793 gallons. At 430 gallons per minute net inflow, the damage access space reaches capacity in approximately 1.8 minutes from the point the P250 starts. When the damage access space fills, the water begins entering the adjacent spaces through the frame 59 watertight access hatch, which cannot hold pressure from the flooding side when the compartment is full. The flood is manageable at reduced speed. At 21 knots, it is not manageable. At 14 knots, the ship's transit speed before the engagement. The dynamic pressure drops enough to reduce the flooding rate to approximately 420 gallons per minute, which 2 P250 pumps can marginally manage. The chief engineer calls the commanding officer at 3:12:07 a.m. Captain, engineering. I need speed reduced to 14 knots or below to manage the flooding at frame 61. At current speed, the flooding rate exceeds our dewatering capacity. The commanding officer. Engineering. I need speed to maintain battery range separation. How long? The chief engineer has anticipated this. 14 knots still gives you approximately 850 meters per minute of range separation from the battery. 12 minutes to effective range. The compromise buys us 12 minutes of manageable flooding and 12 minutes to range safety. I need that speed reduction to set up a repair. The commanding officer authorizes 14 knots at 3:12:14 a.m. The breach at frame 61 is the repair problem. The flooding rate drops to approximately 420 gallons per minute at 14 knots. Two P250 pumps together produce 500 gallons per minute dewatering capacity. The net is 80 gallons per minute dewatering. The damage access space at frame 59 is now being slowly dewatered rather than filling. This buys time. It does not fix the breach. The breach dimensions: 35 centimeters by 62 centimeters. Irregular shape, ragged inward bent edges. Located 0.4 meters below the waterline on the port hull. The standard Arleigh-Burke damage control inventory for a breach of this character and these dimensions is: a rubber sheet speed patch with a C-clamp harness. Rated for openings up to approximately 25 centimeters by 35 centimeters. The Wilbur's breach is larger, 35 centimeters by 62 centimeters. And its irregular shape, with inward bent edges at varying angles, means the rubber sheet cannot seat against the hull face to form a seal. The C-clamp harness requires a flat hull surface to develop clamping force. There is no flat hull surface at the breach. The inward bent edges prevent it. The wooden plug approach, conical wooden plugs driven into the breach, is applicable for breaches with a defined geometry, typically a circular or near-circular opening from a penetration. The 152 millimeter round's detonation created a non-geometric, irregular tear. There is no opening geometry that a standard conical plug can address. A plug driven into a 35 centimeter by 62 centimeter tear with inward bent metal edges will not seal. The geometry prevents contact pressure distribution. The chief engineer identifies the constraint at 3:12:30 a.m. and calls the repair party. The breach at frame 61 is 35 by 62 centimeters. Irregular shape, edges bent inward. Standard patches and plugs will not seat. I need a welded steel patch. I need a steel plate. The generator room has a spare 6 millimeter hull repair plate in the DC materials store. It is approximately 45 by 75 centimeters. Correct size? I need the plate cut to the breach perimeter and welded over the breach from the inside. The aft DC locker has a portable arc welder with a 100-meter cable run. The repair party leader responds at 3:12:43 a.m. Chief, there is JP5 fuel in the tank adjacent to the breach. What is the vapor concentration in the frame 59 space? This is the second dimension of the problem. The forward JP5 fuel storage compartment's inner hull is intact. 8 millimeters of deformation, but no fracture. However, the flooding seawater entering the void space between the outer and inner hull is at 3 degrees Celsius west sea temperature. Cold seawater against the intact inner hull face of the JP5 tank, which contains fuel at approximately 14 degrees Celsius, produces condensation on the inner hull surface and an ambient cooling of the tank. Cooling the JP5 tank reduces the vapor pressure at the fuel surface, which reduces the JP5 vapor concentration in the adjacent spaces. This is, counterintuitively, favorable for the welding repair. Lower vapor concentration means a more favorable condition for hot work. But the seawater that has entered the void space and is pooling in the damage access space at frame 59 is in contact with fuel residue from the inner hull surface condensation and from the fitting connections in the frame 59 access space. There is a small but real vapor contribution from JP5 residue in the flooded space, even with the main tank intact. The chief engineer needs to know the current vapor concentration before authorizing arc welding. He calls DC Central. Get the combustible gas indicator to frame 59 access space immediately. I need an LEL reading before I authorize welding. The LEL, lower explosive limit. For JP5, is approximately 0.6% by volume. At concentrations below 10% of LEL, that is, below 0.06% JP5 by volume. Hot work such as arc welding is permitted in the U.S. Navy's hot work authorization procedure. At concentrations between 10 and 20% LEL, hot work requires continuous monitoring and standby fire suppression. Above 20% LEL, hot work is prohibited. The damage controlman with the combustible gas indicator reaches the frame 59 access space at 3:13:22 a.m. He reads the indicator and reports to DC Central at 3:13:28 a.m. LEL. Reading in the frame 59 space is 4.2%. That is 4.2% of the lower explosive limit for JP5. Current reading is below the 10% threshold, 4.2% LEL, below the 10% threshold for permitted hot work. But the concentration is not static. It is 4.2% now at 3:13:28 a.m. in a space that is being actively flooded with cold seawater. The cold seawater is suppressing vapor evaporation from the fuel residue. As the space floods and the water level rises, the vapor space above the water decreases, and the concentration of vapor in the remaining air volume increases. Additionally, as the two P250 pumps work to reduce the flooding, the water level will fluctuate. A fluctuating water surface over JP5 residue produces intermittent vapor releases that can spike the concentration briefly above the steady-state reading. The chief engineer calls the repair party. Current LEL is 4.2%, below the hot work threshold. I am authorizing welding under continuous gas monitoring. I need a continuous LEL reading every 60 seconds during the welding operation. If the reading exceeds 10% LEL, welding stops immediately. If it exceeds 15% LEL, all personnel leave the space. We are not working above 10%. He calls DC Central. I need the fire main hose laid to the frame 59 access space with an AFFF capable handline ready. If I call fire in that space, I need AFFF on it in under 30 seconds. The repair party leader confirms the portable arc welder in the aft DC locker at 3:13:44 a.m. The welder is a 180 amp DC arc welder with a 100-meter cable, sufficient to reach frame 59 from the ship's emergency power outlet at frame 80. The repair plate is a 45 by 75 centimeter, 6 millimeter steel plate used for hull patchwork, flat and undrilled. The repair requires cutting the plate to fit the breech perimeter, the irregular 35 by 62 centimeter opening, and welding it over the breech from inside the void space, accessed through the frame 59 hatch. Cutting the plate to the breech perimeter requires a template. The breech perimeter is irregular. The metal worker in the repair party enters the frame 59 access space at 3:13:51 a.m. wading through water that is now at knee depth despite the P250 dewatering, and traces the breech perimeter onto cardboard from the damage control kit using a marking stylus. The tracing takes 80 seconds. He exits at 3:15:11 a.m. with the cardboard template and immediately begins cutting the repair plate to the template using the angle grinder from the DC locker. The plate cutting takes 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The cut plate is ready at 3:19:31 a.m. It matches the breech perimeter template within approximately 8 millimeters. The hand-cut plate will not be perfectly aligned with the irregular breech edge, but welding bridges gaps of up to 8 millimeters without loss of structural integrity at the weld interface. At 3:19:31 a.m., the flooding situation in the frame 59 access space is water level at 28 centimeters, declining slowly as the two P250 pumps maintain a net dewatering rate of approximately 80 gallons per minute. The LEL reading at 3:19 a.m. was 5.1%, slightly elevated from the 3:13 reading as the water level fluctuation has released additional vapor. still below the 10% threshold. The fire main hose with AFFF is staged at the frame 59 hatch. The battery to the northeast has not fired since the second salvo. The ship is now 11 nautical miles from the battery and outside effective 152 millimeter range as of approximately 3:18 a.m. The immediate tactical pressure has resolved. The immediate DC pressure has not. The welding team, 2 personnel, the metal worker, and the damage controlman, enters the frame 59 access space at 3:19:47 a.m. The welder is carried by the metal worker. The repair plate is lowered through the hatch by the damage controlman. The water in the space is now at 22 centimeters, knee-deep, cold. The flooding residue containing the JP5 traces that are producing the LEL reading. Both team members are in SCBA. The SCBA provides protection against fuel vapor inhalation at the concentrations present. And in the event the LEL spikes during welding, SCBA ensures the welders are not incapacitated by vapor before they can exit. The metal worker positions the repair plate over the breech from the inside of the void space. The plate must be held against the breech face, while the initial tack welds are applied to hold it in position. The breech face, the inward bent edges of the torn hull, is partially submerged. The bottom portion of the breech is below the current water level in the void space, meaning the lower 8 centimeters of the breech is underwater. Welding underwater is not arc welding. It requires a dry zone. The metal worker uses a rubber mallet to create a temporary seal at the bottom of the breech by driving a wooden plug into the lower portion of the breech below the waterline. Not to stop the flooding permanently, but to reduce the flood rate at the bottom of the breech enough to prevent water from immediately shorting out the welding arc during the first tack welds. The wooden plug seats partially. It reduces, but does not stop the water flow from the lower breech section. LEL, reading at 3:20:30 a.m., 5.8%, still below threshold. The metal worker applies the first tack weld at 3:20:47 a.m. A 30 millimeter weld bead at the upper left corner of the repair plate, where the breech edge is above the current water level and the hull surface is accessible for the electrode contact. The arc strikes. The weld bead is laid. No fire. No vapor ignition. The LEL reading immediately after the first arc strike at 3:20:51 a.m., 6.3%. The heat of the arc has locally increased the JP5 vapor release rate from the adjacent fuel residue. The reading is elevated, but below threshold. Second tack weld at the upper right corner, 3:21:04 a.m. Third tack weld at the mid-left, 3:21:21 a.m. The plate is now held against the breech face by 3 tack welds and will not fall away when the metal worker repositions for the continuous weld runs. LEL, reading at 3:21:30 a.m., 7.1%. Elevated, below 10%. The continuous monitoring is holding the operation within the safe window. The metal worker begins the continuous weld run. A full penetration fillet weld run around the perimeter of the repair plate, sealing the plate to the breech edge. The run starts at the upper left and proceeds clockwise. The weld proceeds steadily. The irregular breech edge makes the weld run non-uniform, requiring the metal worker to adjust electrode angle continuously to maintain arc length across the uneven edge geometry. The lower portion of the breech, where the wooden plug has partially reduced the flooding, is the most difficult section. The water seeping past the plug is cooling the weld immediately after application, producing a weld bead that is less uniform than the upper sections, but structurally adequate. While EL reading at 3:22 a.m., 8.4%. The reading is approaching the 10% threshold. The chief engineer, monitoring from DC Central via the damage controlman's continuous readings, calls the team LEL at 8.4%. Continue, but be ready to stop. If it reaches 9.5, I am calling a stop. LEL reading at 3:22:30 a.m., 8.1%. The reading has decreased slightly. The weld run is past the midpoint of the lower breech section, where the JP5 residue concentration is highest, and is now progressing toward the lower right corner, where the hull surface is drier. The continuous weld run completes at 3:23:47 a.m. The repair plate is fully welded to the breech perimeter. The weld run covers the entire breech perimeter, approximately 195 centimeters of continuous fillet weld. The wooden plug at the lower breech section is encapsulated by the weld. It will remain in place as a backing material. The metal worker and damage controlman exit the frame 59 access space at 3:23:55 a.m. LEL. Reading at 3:24 a.m., 6.2%, declining as the welding heat source has been removed. And the air circulation through the STO-CBA exhaust has slightly diluted the vapor concentration. The weld is given 3 minutes to cool before pressure testing. At 3:26:52 a.m., the chief engineer authorizes a flood test. The P250 pump suctions are removed from the frame 59 space, and the bilge is allowed to fill for 60 seconds to determine whether the welded patch is holding. The water level in the frame 59 space at 3:26:52 a.m. is 14 centimeters. Declining. The P250 pumps are stopped. The water level is observed for 60 seconds. At 3:27:52 a.m., the water level in the frame 59 space has risen to 17 centimeters. A 3-centimeter rise in 60 seconds is equivalent to an ingress rate of approximately 11 gallons per minute. A reduction from the pre-repair 420 gallons per minute rate to approximately 2.6% of the original ingress. The weld is holding under the current dynamic pressure conditions. The 11 gallons per minute residual ingress is from seepage through minor gaps at the irregular breech edge, where the weld did not achieve full contact. A predictable outcome from a field repair on an irregular surface. A single P250 pump handles 11 gallons per minute without difficulty. The P250 pump is restarted at 3:27:56 a.m. The frame 59 access space begins dewatering. By 3:38 a.m., the space is dry. The residual 11 gallons per minute seepage through the weld perimeter gaps is within the P250's continuous management capability and does not require additional action before the ship reaches Busan. The battery fired its last round at 3:11:52 a.m. The Wilbur is now 14.3 nautical miles from the battery position, outside effective range. The commanding officer authorizes a return to the transit corridor at 3:29 a.m. and a speed increase to 16 knots as the flooding situation has been declared managed. The LEL reading in the frame 59 access space at 3:35 a.m. is 2.1%, declining as the space is ventilated after the P250 dewatering reduces the fuel residue surface area. The welded patch will hold for the 8-hour transit to Busan. At Busan, the yard team opens the void space and inspects the weld. Their assessment: functional field weld, adequate penetration along 87% of the weld run perimeter, gap seepage at 3 points along the lower irregular breech edge, where the inward bent hull geometry prevented full electrode contact. The gap seepage was the source of the 11 gallons per minute residual. Permanent repair at Busan. The repair plate is cut away. The breech is squared with a plasma cutter to produce a regular rectangular opening. And a correctly dimensioned steel insert plate is welded in under controlled dry dock conditions. One 152mm high explosive round impacted the port hull at frame 61, 0.4 meters below the waterline. At 3:11:47 a.m., breech dimensions: 35 by 62 centimeters, irregular. Flooding rate at flank speed: 680 gallons per minute. Speed reduced to 14 knots. Flooding rate 420 gallons per minute, managed by 2 P250 pumps at net 80 gallons per minute dewatering. Standard patches and plugs inapplicable. Irregular breech geometry. Welded steel repair plate. 6 mm plate cut to template in 4 minutes, 20 seconds. Hot work authorized at LEL 4.2%. Continuous LEL monitoring throughout welding. Peak reading 8.4%. Threshold 10%. Welding complete at 3:23:47 a.m. Residual seepage 11 gallons per minute, managed by single P250. Battery out of range at 3:18 a.m. Ship status operational. The arc welder used for the repair has a serial number. It was manufactured in 1991. It has been calibrated and maintained at every scheduled interval. It has been used for 6 training welds and drills over its service life. The weld it produced at 3:20:47 a.m. on the port hull of the Wilbur at frame 61 in knee-deep water in the West Sea at -16 degrees effective temperature, with an LEL reading of 6.3% and rising, in a space being actively monitored for vapor ignition, is the 7th weld the welder has ever produced aboard this ship. The metal worker who ran the weld bead was the qualified welder on the Wilbur's DC roster. He was qualified 14 months ago at a DC training pipeline that included 1 session of structural welding in simulated emergency conditions. The simulation did not include cold water, active vapor monitoring, or a ship that was turning away from an artillery battery at 14 knots. His qualification said he could weld. The simulation said he had welded once under pressure. The West Sea at 3:20 a.m. said the same thing was required again. He welded. The plate held. The ship came home.